Yeah, the thumb goes up so we can start. Welcome to the Aviation Conversation. I'm Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home. I'm delighted that you can all be here, especially delighted that Mark Harper, Transport Secretary, can be here for this event with Airlines UK, Airbus, Heathrow and Manchester Airports Group. And so the Aviation Conversation will begin with a topical note, and you'll see immediately, Mark, where this question is coming from. How important to airports, given they have to be connected to roads and to rail, is HS2?
Well, Paul, that was very cleverly worked into the conversation. I anticipated that. Look, the Prime Minister was asked about this morning, and he made it very clear he likes to make decisions in a thoughtful way. He will take the time to make the decisions correctly, and then he will set them out at his own time, not be bounced into it by the media, however lovely and supportive a particular media organisation is.
So you're not even able to say in outline that the project's important?
Well, we're getting on with building it. There are spades in the ground, and just to expand slightly, all sorts of other types of construction equipment as well. It'd be taking quite a long time if we were only using spades. There are it's a big project. We're spending a lot of money on it. The first phase of it is underway. It's going at considerable pace, and those people that were at the conference last year will have seen the transformative effect it's had in Birmingham. But any future decisions, it's all speculation so far. The Prime Minister made it clear this morning he will set out any decisions he is going to take, and he's had time to consider them properly.
When we roll back from all the present to and fro about HS2 and the consequences, I gather, of a government official having a paper photographed somewhere, which set this train of events off. Let me take you back to the beginning when you were first appointed Transport Secretary, because I came here last year and had this conversation with Anne-Marie Trevelyan. I've had it before with Grant Shapps, who had a special interest in aviation because he flew planes. How important was it to you when you arrived at the department, given that you spent quite a lot of time recently on the political hot topic in the wake of the Uxbridge and West Ruislip by-election on roads?
Well, one of the interesting things is when I first got this job a year ago, and obviously it's quite interesting being at a conference. I had a very different conference last year when I was a backbencher. When I first got the job, because of the fact we were in the middle of industrial action across the rail network, including still on Network Rail, I spent my first period in the job spending an awful lot of time on trains. And one of the things I've said consistently since I got this job, which people in the department are probably bored hearing, is I lead the department for transport, not the department for trains. And so one of the things I've been very keen to do, which is relevant to the discussion today and the important sponsors today, is to remember that actually it's the whole transport connectivity that's important. So I'm very careful to spend, yes, I spend time on trains because they're important, but also on the aviation sector, which is incredibly important, and we'll talk more about that obviously, but also roads. It's very important to remember that, which is the reason why we set out the plan for drivers. I set out the plan for drivers in my speech yesterday. 60% of journeys that take place in this country are by car, 30% are walking, 4% are buses, and 2% are trains. So most people outside London, the normal way that most people in our country get to work is in a car. And if they're not lucky enough to have a car, the most likely alternative form of transport is a bus. And that's not how the national conversation usually takes place. It's normally not that at all. And we said that when we launched the plan for drivers. We said how we thought it might be received by those that are based in the metropolitan bubble. And I'm afraid on the Twitter that those based in the metropolitan bubble basically did demonstrate that's exactly how they received it, rather dismissive of people that use cars, which is most of the country, and some people slightly lost their minds in terms of the disproportionate response.
So when you said to your department, remember this isn't just a department for trains, that wasn't just because of the strikes. You felt that there might be that bias in the department anyway.
Well, I think if you look at the big difference between the different sectors is because of what happened during the pandemic particularly, we are much more hands-on with trains. So Network Rail, for many years, is an arm's length body. I am legally the shareholder, so I own that on behalf of the British people. And because of what happened during the pandemic, when we basically told people not to travel, the train operating companies are now run with all of the revenue risk with the Treasury, all the cost risk with my department, and train operating companies, most of them contracted to us, get paid a small margin with some extra money if they do a good job. And so, because we have that control, we spend a lot of time on it. You know, airlines, fantastically, are largely a private sector operation. Private sector airlines, private sector airports, they do a fantastic job getting on with running stuff, and that's the same in the maritime sector. Incredibly important to the UK, 95% of British trade. Largely private sector ports in this country, which is actually unusual, private sector operators. So you don't have to spend as much time running them. And as a Conservative, I gently suggest that bits of the world that are not run by the government tend to be run better. But it means that there's always a danger that you spend all your time thinking about the bit you're most heavily involved in, and you don't think about, are you making good policy choices to support aviation, to support maritime, to make sure they can be decarbonised. You know, people might see my Jet Zero logo on here. You know, the work we're doing, importantly, to make sure aviation plays its part in reaching net zero. We don't want to get to a world where we have to tell people to stop flying. We want to have a world where people can fly, be mobile, travel, see their families, but do it in a way that's consistent with our environmental obligations. And that's decarbonisation across transport's a big piece of the department. So people might not know, because we've made such a lot of progress in decarbonising production of electricity. Transport is now the number one carbon emitting part of the economy. So we're not going to hit our really important net zero obligations, which, as the Prime Minister set out 2 weeks ago, we haven't changed. We're not going to hit those if we don't deliver on transport.
Let's come to net zero soon. So just first of all, can you just say more about what your aviation priorities are? Given the landscape you've described, private sector, you're taken up with almost this ding-dong between roads and rail and where you focus your attention. What are your priorities for aviation between now and the next election? Bearing in mind, it may be a year away, it could be 6 months away.
So I think two things. One is making sure that the things that we have responsibility for work well. So there was an example a few weeks ago where if something goes badly, we had the people will be very clear about what happened with National Air Traffic Services. You had a relatively, in some senses, a small incident, but it had a massive impact on hundreds of thousands of people, disrupted their journeys, cost airlines a significant amount of money, and the role we played, we weren't directly responsible operationally, but the role I played and the department played was working with all of the partners, airlines, airports, NATS, the CAA, working with all of them, having a number of meetings during that period to make sure that the sector as a whole worked together in partnership to get customers back where they needed to be without them being out of pocket. And so there's that sort of stuff, because if you don't deal with that sort of thing, it then becomes a massive issue. So playing our part in making sure things work properly, I think, is probably number one, because if you don't do that, you don't get to do the other stuff. And then probably the second most important one is working on the decarbonisation agenda with sustainable aviation fuel, the developments on hydrogen, because frankly, if this is one of the most difficult sectors to decarbonise, and if we don't do it, there will become increasing pressure for people not to fly. And we had an experiment over the last few years, not one that anyone would want to repeat, but it was actually an interesting test. We had the pandemic, we basically told people they couldn't fly, and it wasn't clear what would happen when the pandemic was over. And what we actually saw was people really do want to fly. And it's not just going on holiday, it's seeing their friends and their families around the world. And in our country, with our global connections, we saw, when we told people they couldn't fly, huge numbers of people who wanted to travel for really important family reasons. So there's business, there's trade, we're a global trading nation. So we have to make sure, so people demonstrated they want to fly. So for me, when we're thinking about our climate obligations, for me, telling people they can't fly and doing what is euphemistically called demand management, which is basically taxing flying so only rich people get to do it, is not, I think, where we want to go. We want to work with the industry on developing technology so that you can fly in a way that is consistent with protecting the environment. And that, I think, is probably the next most important thing in aviation that my department needs to do over the next year and years to come.
All right. Let me pick you up on NATS, then on sort of the consumer experience, and then on net zero. So first about NATS. My understanding is it's about, problem took about 4 hours to fix, but 3 days of immense disruption with flights being late or not being able to take off and all that. And the industry would say, why are we bearing the costs of all this? Why aren't the traffic controllers taking more responsibility for what happened? And the incentives here are all wrong, and there's a problem with moral hazard.
So the way NATS works, without going and spending hours on it and boring everyone, the bit of NATS that was affected is the bit that does the air traffic control system across the piece. It's a regulated business, so it is a private company, but its charges to its airline customers are set by a regulator. The CAA does that, so they don't just get to charge what they like. And there's rules about the service level that they have to deliver. And there was in this particular case, it was a technical issue. They often have technical issues which they usually solve in a relatively short period of time. They cause no disruption. In this particular case, there was a set of circumstances that they have never seen before in 50 million pieces of data. And it took a bit longer to get resolved. And therefore, it impacted on flights. They never shut the airspace. But because their primary responsibility, which I, as a person who flies, is quite happy this is their primary responsibility, is safety, what they had to do was they had to use a more manual system, and they had to therefore reduce capacity, and that's what caused the disruption. And airlines were then forced to have to cancel flights. People couldn't return home. Airlines had to prioritise which flights they should fly. And it took several days for that to work its way through.
So the airlines did have to bear all the costs.
And the airlines bore all the costs. Now, there's an argument about whether that should remain the position. The CAA, as you may know, is going to commission an independent review. They finalised the terms of reference. They will be announcing this week the terms of reference, and the chair for that inquiry, who will be independent, that will then report to the CAA and to me. And then we will look at, and that will look across the piece at all of the things that happened and the impact on the airlines, and that will produce a set of conclusions, and that will come to ministers then for CA will look to see if there are things they should do, and ministers will then look to see if there are changes we should make.
Do you know when that report will come to you?
I think, if I remember rightly, they're looking to have it done reasonably pacey, but obviously doing it thoroughly, and I think it'll probably be early next year. Very early.
So you would be able to make a response to it before the election?
I would hope to, but obviously that will depend on when the election takes place, which is not a matter for me.
So actually, if another incident of this kind, God helps, happened after the report was published and you made your response, it might be that the industry didn't bear all the costs. But if this happened tomorrow, heaven help us, you'd be back in the same situation again.
Yeah, the rules that exist now are the rules that exist now. I mean, the good thing is the particular thing that happened shouldn't cause that problem again, because, as you would expect, they have fixed that particular issue and they have learned some lessons about how to respond to similar sorts of issues. But obviously you can never rule out something happening. What I think is worth saying is that the industry, as it often does in these circumstances, so that's airlines, airports, the regulator and NAT, actually worked incredibly well as a team, and in just getting people home, working collaboratively. Sometimes people had spare capacity and they brought other people's passengers home. So actually I think the industry worked incredibly hard, didn't do finger pointing, it did focus on getting the job done, and we worked with them, and my department worked with them on the things we needed to do to try and make that work. And you know, it was clearly inconvenient for people, but I hope we minimise the impact on the travelling public, which is, as I said, all of our responsibilities. But I think the industry demonstrated it's one where, when difficult things happen, actually people pull together and deliver.
And let's just turn to airports and the kind of consumer experience. As you just described, the effects of the pandemic, closure of airports, people coming back afterwards. I kind of wanted to ask you a question about what you think the voter perception of the industry is. Just as we were waiting to have this conversation, someone came up here, who I know, who said, I said, when are you going back to your base in London? I said, tomorrow. How are you getting back? Oh, I'm being very naughty and I'm flying. Right. Now, do you think there's still hanging around the industry this kind of air of it's somehow bad to fly because of the emissions issue.
Well, I think that there is an issue there, and I think and clearly some consumers put that more highly than others. But I think the industry is very clear about it. If you talk to any airline or airport or aeroplane manufacturer or engine manufacturer, they absolutely know that they are only going to get permission to operate in the future if they decarbonise air transport. And it's whether it's sustainable aviation fuel for long haul or hydrogen for medium haul, or actually for short haul smaller planes, actually you will be able to have battery electric ones. That range of solutions, there's a ton of money going into development. Some of it's taxpayer money, so there are competitions that we run to try and deliver innovation, but the industry is doing it. They absolutely know. And the Jet Zero thing that I brandished earlier is a council that I co-chair with the Net Zero Secretary and the Business Secretary, which brings all of the pieces of the industry together at senior level and then down at official level to get the industry working in partnership to decarbonise it. And by the way, it's something that's globally understood as well. So earlier this year I was in the US, Secretary Buttigieg, the US Transportation Secretary, and I chaired a summit specifically looking at sustainable aviation fuel with investors, with traditional fuel producers, to talk about how we decarbonise at pace, which I think is essential if we're going to keep flying and aviation functioning in the future.
And tell us about your plans for the sustainable fuel, because my understanding is it's going to provide a lot of the heavy lifting for getting to net zero. But at the moment anyway, it is more expensive than the fuel that's currently used. So who's going to bear the cost for this? Is it going to be the taxpayer? Is it going to be the industry? And to what extent are you going to share the burden between the two?
So the modelling that has been done by the industry coalition suggests that it will mean a modest increase in prices, but they're very keen and I'm very keen that isn't the way you deal with the issue, because that's...
So increase prices for whom?
For consumers.
For consumers, yeah.
But what you want to do is make that as minimal as possible, because you don't want to drive people away from flying.
Yes.
In terms of how we drive up production of SAF, the conversation at the moment is the various players in the industry want some sort of, what's the best way of describing it, some sort of price stability mechanism,
yes,
so that you give some certainty to investors. And what we're talking about at the moment is, what does that look like? Government's view is, I think, that should primarily be an industry solution, but the question is, what sort of role does government play? Do we act as an insurer of last resort? Do we have a backstop? Is it some sort of contracts for difference model that we've used in power generation? What exactly is it? What's the market failure that we're trying to fix? And those are live conversations that we're having at the moment. We're very clear that we need to assist and work with industry to deliver this, but equally we have a responsibility to not spend taxpayers' money where we don't need to, but we want to come up with a very good solution. And in the energy bill that's just going through Parliament, an amendment was accepted that gives us a responsibility to publish a consultation on this particular subject in the next few months, and we're working with the industry players to work out what a solution should look like.
This is another timetable question. Or what's the timetable for getting a decision on what the mechanism looks like?
So it is literally live, and we're having conversations about it. I've actually had conversations about it while I've been here. It's come up on some of the conversations we've had at the party conference. But my officials are working at pace with the industry, talking to them about what that needs to look like, so that we can increase the supply of SAF, so that those players can accelerate their use of it. Some airlines are moving faster than others, and in fact there's a test in November. Virgin Atlantic won a competition with us. They are going to attempt a 100% sustainable aviation fuel flight from London to New York as a very visible sign of how you can deliver this, to show that this sort of technology is current, it's deliverable, and it's how we're going to decarbonise aviation.
You said discussions are currently taking place and so on. Will they be concluded before, say, next May?
I would very much hope so.
And just looking ahead, you said prices for consumers will have to rise slightly. Now, I'm just thinking this through. I'm hearing a kind of warning bell in the back of my mind, and the warning bell says EULAs. In other words, you get a consumer...
Not taxes.
not
hasten to
taxes,
add,
but
no.
but the bill, not taxes, no, but the prices begin to rise,
Mm-hmm.
and you have restive consumers. What happens then? Are the consumers just going to lap it up, or I'm at the edges of my sort of speculative reasoning here. I mean, do you get a sort of consumer revolt? And if so,
Well,
what happens then?
I think first of all, I think consumers are very aware of the environmental impact of flying. So I think actually, if you talk to airlines, who obviously are the primary liaison with their customers, and you talk to airports, people are very clear that they want aviation to have less impact on the environment. And our job is to make sure, that's government working with the industry, is to make sure the price impact of that is as small as possible. So there are those people that argue that we should use what they euphemistically call demand management to deal with this issue, which is code for, as I said, stopping people flying. That is not the solution that we want to deliver. So part of what we're trying to do in terms of growing the production of sustainable aviation fuel and developing hydrogen, the reason why the government's putting taxpayers' money into some of this is to accelerate the development of it, is to reduce the risk of it, and ultimately reduce the cost of it, so that you can deliver an affordable aviation experience for people, so that actually we can still have people flying from ordinary backgrounds who've worked hard, who want to go on their family holiday, who want to go and see their family abroad, and they can still do that just as they do today. We don't want to price people out of flying.
I'm going to ask you a question which very rarely is not a question that has something at the end about a deadline before the next election, because I know it's not going to be met. It's a kind of bigger question about airports and airlines. Namely, no one is expecting you to solve the problems of capacity between now and next October. But for as long as we've both been around, there's been this rumbling issue about the expansion of Heathrow, the expansion of Gatwick, the expansion of airports generally. I mean, without going back for a moment to HS2, isn't there a huge problem in this country about planning generally and building? It is quite hard to do. Quite a small country, comparatively, very active legal system, as you'd expect, ancient planning law, lots of environmental considerations, judicial review minister, and all that. Is there a systematic problem about how fast we build everything from airports to houses?
Well, let me do that in the more general thing and then specific about airports. So on airports, I apologise if this sounds a very careful answer, but there are some current planning things in the system for some airports, and since I am the person that has to make the decisions, I have to be very careful not to say anything about any of the specific ones, for exactly the reasons you've just said. Otherwise that will cause us problems. So, in general terms, we do have I think we have a decent planning system actually for airports, where you do weigh up all of these issues. There's those people that think you can just make all this go really quickly, and I know why people get frustrated. You do have to balance. When you're a politician, you do have to balance competing interests. Airports generate noise and traffic, and but people also want to be able to fly from them. They create enormous economic value, and someone has to balance all of those things. And not everyone will be happy about the outcome, but I think what you have to do is make people comfortable that there's been a proper process. So part of what the planning system's trying to do is to balance all of those things, make sure they've all probably been weighted, and then things are put in place with proper conditions attached to them so that you get the right outcome. And that is inevitably complicated and time-consuming, and those decisions are... I don't think there's ever going to be a system in a democratic country where you can just do this stuff incredibly quickly. And obviously sometimes you get slightly absurd conversations where people compare us to China. Well, yes, you can build things really fast in China, in a communist dictatorship, where you can just basically, there's no free press, there's no free legal system, you can just decide to do stuff and people don't get to push back on it. So that's not, people sort of talk about how quickly they build airports and runways. Well, that's just not a sensible comparison. In democratic countries, it's all quite difficult. Now, could we make the system better? Possibly. Would you ever get to a position where you could, decide you wanted to do something and decide in a few months? Probably not. So I think the system we've got at the moment does actually weigh up all those challenges. We absolutely could make it go faster, I'm sure, and we do look constantly to see, can you, whilst balancing those interests, speed things up, get rid of unnecessary bureaucracy and try and make the system. But you have got issues that have to be properly balanced against each other. and you do have to have a system that does that. And in the end, there are democratically accountable people that have to balance those things and then explain them to people and explain what you've balanced and what you've taken into account. And in big picture, aviation is really important for growing the economy and Britain's place in the world as a global country. The fact we have so many people in this country, which is a good thing, who are first, second, third generation migrants, who have therefore families across the whole world, as we saw during the pandemic when we told people they couldn't fly, and you had all of these interconnected pieces of people's lives that then came out and we had to make exceptions for really important things. So aviation is really important. We have to make those decisions. We have to put the capacity in place, but we have to do it in a way which balances all those essential interests.
And thinking about aviation over time, final question from me. The debate for as long as I remember has been, do you expand Heathrow? Do you expand Gatwick? Back in the 1970s, people were looking at Maplin, Boris Island and all that. Has the conversation been too south-focused over 50 years or so? Governments have tried to do more in the Midlands and North, at Manchester, say, or Birmingham?
This is a bit where I have to be very careful about geography because of the live applications. Look, the reason why the conversations have been as they are is because that's where the demand's been. I think we have seen over recent years more successful regional airports growing. I mean, if I pick one that's nearest me, Bristol's got is a fantastically successful airport. I can talk about it because it has had a planning thing, but that's gone through the system and it's sort of out the other side. It's expanded, it's doing a really good commercial job, and we've obviously got some of the sponsors of this event are obviously not in the southeast. So I think we are seeing actually airports across the UK expanding. One of the things I do when I go on visits is you often, if you start them and finish them at airports, you obviously talk to the airport about their business. This year, overall, aviation is going to be back to broadly where it was pre-pandemic, not everywhere. So it has bounced back very well. They're all very ambitious to grow, to generate wealth for their communities and their parts of the United Kingdom and the connectivity that brings. So, I mean, I want to see airports expanding everywhere, but I want to see it done in a way that's consistent with environmental protection.
Thank you. Now let's have some questions. So if I can see some hands, I will take the gentleman right at the back and then you. So, yeah.
Jay Asher from Airbus. Thanks very much for your remarks, Secretary of State. Obviously, the sector works very closely with you on the Jet Zero Council, and really great to hear you mention some of those work streams. Do you think as a sector we do enough to work with you and the government in talking about the real sort of economic benefits that the sector collectively kind of brings to the UK? And do you think, would you challenge us to do more of that with you?
I think you do a lot, but I think we could do more. And in fact, I was having a conversation earlier today about one aspect which I don't think is well enough understood. I was talking to one of the big freight companies. They are themselves a very significant airline, and I don't think perhaps people understand quite how much, when they go on a passenger flight, I don't think they quite understand often how much freight is carried in those planes. And actually we saw that during the pandemic, where lots of planes were still flying about the world. They didn't have any passengers on them, but they were still carrying a lot of freight about. So I think there's probably a good argument to make about not just the bit that people understand well, which is the people moving part of the operation, but actually understanding how important freight is, particularly for the sort of freight that you move on aeroplanes, which is high value freight. I used to work for a company called Intel, which makes microprocessors. That's small items that are very high value. They used to move a lot about fast by air freight. Really important, valuable part of the economy. So no, I think we probably could do collectively a better job of explaining the importance of it and why therefore we have to decarbonise it and make sure we can carry on doing flying, but in a way that protects the environment.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yes, I would like to just ask about HS2. And I mean, we know that the Prime Minister is thinking about it. We know he's not going to say what his decision is or when it is, and when you're not going to say that. But in the context, you were just talking about China in the context.
Would you mind introducing yourself?
Sorry, yes, BBC News, Damien Grammaticus. You were just asked about China, and you were saying that we have to explained decisions and the context decisions, the balance that we make. I'm just interested in the balance in this case. I mean, what is your view of balance of the issues there? What are the, as Transport Secretary, how important is capacity on the railways? Is it possible to deliver similar benefits if you cut it and spread it to different projects? What's your input into this, or are you having no input into this?
Damien, that's a very good attempt at you to try and lure me onto some hypothetical territory. I'm going to stick with what I said at the beginning, which is what the Prime Minister said this morning, which is he is, as he does with all decisions, he thinks about them very carefully. He is all across the detail. One of the things you have to do if you're in his government is you better know your subject extremely well, or you will discover he knows it better than you do, and that's not a good place to be. And as he said this morning, when he has reached conclusions, he, as you saw 2 weeks ago when he did his speech about net zero, he will set them out and he will explain why he makes the decisions that he does. And some people won't like them, and that's okay.
Right, two more. And there and there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary of State. My name's Cole. I'm a young Conservative from Torbay. How are you ensuring that young people are involved in the decision-making in sustainability within both aviation and the entire transport sector?
Okay, so a very good question, Carl. So one of the things that I am very keen to do is make sure that we actually get to two things. First of all, that we get more opportunities actually for people to join the sector themselves. So one of the good opportunities I had was going to Heathrow actually and meeting both with Virgin Atlantic and British Airways is apprentices that they're taking on. So that's people right across their operations, whether it's engineering, ground crew, cabin crew, or management trainees, so across the whole operation. So there's a really important job to get more people into aviation from a more diverse background and give them the opportunity to do that. And then I think in terms of decision making is making sure part of the reason why the industry and government understands that it's really important that we deliver on the environmental obligations is because we want to make sure that we leave behind a world that's better than the one we inherited. I'm very conscious, lots of people at Conservative conferences talk about Margaret Thatcher, so I will just tick that box. She, in 1988, she made a speech where she talked about climate change, one of the first world leaders to do so, and she reminded us as Conservatives that we don't have a freehold on the earth, we have a lease, and we have a full repairing lease, and we've got to make sure we leave the world in a good shape. So that's why I'm very clear that both on aviation but also on road transport, that's why we published the zero emission vehicle mandate last week, the most ambitious mandate for decarbonising road transport anywhere in the world. It's exactly the same trajectory to 2030 that we consulted on. We made a slight tweak a couple of weeks ago to the 2030 to 35 period, but we are sticking to our climate obligations because I want to make sure that the world you'll get to see more of, because you're a bit younger than I am, is in a good a shape as it was when I turned up. And we have a responsibility to do that, and partly you're delivering on that by turning up here and asking me difficult questions. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Colin Hitchens, Councillor in Bromley, but also Head of Sustainability at Biggin Hill Airport, one that's normally associated with Spitfires, but we do serve around about 750 destinations around the world for business aviation. We were the first to introduce SAF at this type of airport, but the price point has made it very, very difficult to sell. Do you have any thoughts about us having statutory percentages of fuel uptake, being SAF, that can rise towards the point where the industry can give us engines that will fly 100% on a regular basis?
Yes, so you make a very good point about, and you mentioned there one of the tools that government has to try and drive this. So we've been very clear we are going to set in the same way we just have and are going to legislate for cars, we are going to have a mandate to legislate for a certain proportion of SAF to be in the mix for aviation fuel. And the point of doing that, it's two ways of driving demand. You either do the way the US has chosen to go with the IRA Act, which is where you chuck loads of subsidy at it. My view as a Conservative is subsidies don't tend to allocate capital efficiently and deliver good business decisions. The advantage of setting a mandate is you set the outcome, which is the proportion of fuel you want to use, or the outcome you want to achieve in terms of zero emissions, then you let the industry develop the technology to do that. The conversation we're having about SAF, which Paul asked me about, is how do we get from now, where the volumes produced are quite low and the price points are quite high, to drive that volume both from new producers and innovators, but also from some of the big existing companies, Shell, Esso, all the usual ones, who will convert their production from their existing products to SAF. So, and that's exactly the conversation we're having. We're very keen to help the industry do that, and we want to try and work out what's the role that government needs to play to get us going on that journey. And of course, as you said, as you drive up volumes, as with all of these things, you'll then reduce the cost, and it'll get closer to the cost of traditional aviation fuel, and it'll be available. But we also have to do it working with our international partners. Aviation is by definition a global business, and we have to work out how to do that in a way that's consistent with all of our global partners.
You want to sort of hand it back, in fact, another hand at the back, there.
Hi, Rich Rogers, Salisbury Conservatives. One of the areas that has got, I think, a lot of innovation potential is the use of unmanned vehicles, particularly in the sort of localised freight, but also in some non-traditional areas, sort of road repairs and other schemes. And I know there's a lot of innovation in that particular sector. I wondered if you had any thoughts about how we can sort of maximise that potential and what are the particular challenges associated with that.
Are you sort of broadly talking about drones and things that sort of scale of?
Yes, anything unmanned, but also sort of that sort of local personal transportation as well, because I know there's some people in that market space.
Okay, so there's two things going on which I've seen examples of. So on the drone side of it, whether it's used by big delivery companies or other ways of getting products about, the key thing there is how you regulate the use of that so that it doesn't end up being dangerous for existing air traffic. So that is something the CAA will be the regulator for, and they're very conscious that they've got to balance. They have in their regulation thing, they of course have safety, but they are also tasked with doing safety in a way that also allows economic growth. So they are working on this stuff at pace. They're working to develop the rules, and they're working with the companies that want to do this work as well in a collaborative way, so they can put in place a regime that will enable safe growth and use of that sort of technology so that we can use it cost effectively and deliver better outcomes. So that work is absolutely underway, and there are specific companies that are working with the CAA on how they're going to implement their operations. On the passenger transport side of it, I've seen several examples where you've got battery electric vehicles, vertical takeoff, massive advantage, Paul, coming back to your point about planning, massive advantage compared to helicopters, that they are very quiet. They could technically be unmanned and controlled from a control room, although I think the companies that are planning on doing it think that customer acceptance will be better if there's an actual pilot sat in the vehicle with the passengers rather than somewhere else. And there are some really big opportunities there where you can potentially, for companies I've spoken to, think they can get to a price point where you could deliver a home to airport taxi service, say, for not much more than the cost of doing a driving taxi service, but do it in a fraction of the time, which would transform transport potentially. But again, that will have a regulatory piece to it to make sure that it's safe, that you're conscious of the places where those vehicles are landing, or those aircraft are landing. But I think the CAA is very clear that its job is to do safety, but to allow and facilitate innovation at the same time, and it has to balance those two duties.
Yes.
David Hughes from the Press Association. Lord David Frost praised Jeremy Hunt for flying up here, saying it showed that you can get from London to Manchester in half an hour already, and that there should be more internal flights. Do you think, especially with what you said about green jet fuels and all that sort of thing, do you think actually more internal flights could be a way of achieving high-speed intercity connectivity in this country, especially given with what may or may not be happening with HS2?
Well, I think the specific example you gave, I think there was some debate today about whether you could actually do the various journeys in the times that were talked about. So I'm not going to intrude on that particular one. I'm going to avoid your attempt again, as Damien did, to draw me into the HS2 conversation. I think, look, what we want to do is give people a range of choices about how they travel, so they can do what's sensible for them and balancing what's sensible for the environment. So, I mean, our approach, if you had to boil it all down, which I think was along the lines of the themes I set out yesterday, we don't want to start telling people how they should travel. We want to have a range of choices. The way you deal with aviation is you make sure you enable it to work in a way that's decarbonised with SAF or hydrogen. And then, frankly, people don't have to worry about its impact on the environment because it doesn't emit carbon at all, and we do the same with vehicles. And then we allow people to make choices about what suits them, and people have to balance, the speed they need to go, the distance they need to travel, the time they need to travel, and actually government shouldn't really want to start telling people how to live their lives. As a Conservative, I believe in people's freedom to choose. I want people to run their own lives. The state should do the things it has to do. It shouldn't do the things it doesn't need to.
Two more, yes. One there, and then we'll do on this. So, you say first.
Hello there, Minister. Aidan Bolton, CCHQ, formerly worked for one of your ministerial predecessors, Robert Courts. Sorry to divert from the topic, but could we get an update on the electric scooter trial and when to expect some further news on that?
Yes. So for those that don't know, electric scooters, e-scooters you're not allowed to use them on public roads, except for those which are in the trials that were taking place in various parts of the country. We've extended those trials. Originally there was, I think, last year or the year before, we were going to have an omnibus transport bill, which would have, amongst other things, looked at changing the legal position for those. That didn't happen. I, of course, can't confirm, Paul, you'll completely understand, and so will you, what will or won't be in the King's speech. That is for His Majesty to set out. There will be a range of choices that the Prime Minister and the government have to make, and we'll have to balance the fact that we will have a limited amount of time, and we'll have to work out what are the things that are going to make the biggest impact on the economy. So for the moment, the trials, we've extended them, so we're still able to learn from them, and so they're continuing. Whether we are able before the election to put them on or set out a permanent footing, people will have to wait about a month or so to find out.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, Dan Hooper from Rolls-Royce. The UK genuinely has a world-leading aerospace technology sector, but with the UK now out of the European Union, the CAA is taking on a lot more responsibility for certification of these technologies. So what assurances can the government give us that the CAA will have the resources it needs to continue keeping pace with the advances that we're making in the aerospace technology sector so that we remain globally leading, not least competitive?
Good. Well, look, you totally agree with your first point, and of course your company and Airbus are obviously part of the hydrogen alliance with EasyJet and Bristol Airport, which is developing hydrogen as a solution for medium haul flights, and that's something that we very much welcome and support, which is why I attended the launch event in Parliament for that. You're right, the CAA has a big responsibility. You wouldn't expect me to just write out a blank cheque, but as I said in answer to a previous question, it has multiple objectives. Top is obviously safety, but it also has a responsibility to help us grow the economy and deliver economic growth. So one of the things that we will take into account when we're thinking about how much money it has to do its job is what we're asking it to do. There are lots of new areas of technology it's having to regulate. We want to make sure it is not a barrier. It's able to move at the pace that is required. I'm sure there'll be robust conversations between what they think they need and what we can give them, but we are very focused on making sure we retain our lead and our advantage that we have in the development of aerospace technology. As you said, we're a global leader in this stuff, and we want to stay in that zone and make sure that companies that are developing innovation in aerospace, we want to make sure the United Kingdom remains one of the places that they invest and they put their best people and they put their best technology.
So, two more. It was there, and the lady there, yeah.
very much. Given the importance of the aerospace sector to the UK, employing circa 111,000 people with billions of pounds worth of exports, what other aspects in relation to those you've already discussed does government and industry need to consider in order to harness the growth of that sector? And secondly, I can't resist this one, but given the point about the potential of services, eVTOL aircraft and home-to-airport services, will those services be limited to 20 miles per hour in Wales?
I'll do that one last as a slightly lighter note on which to finish.
Sorry, and I'm Conservative Party member, David.
Very good. So look, on the first point, I mean, one of the things that we do, which people don't always think government does, but we do, is work obviously across government departments. So the Department for Business obviously leads on the aerospace sector. I work very closely with the Secretary of State there, and the ministerial team works very well, as do our officials, in making sure we think about our part in regulating the aviation sector, but also their responsibility in developing the aerospace industry. We work very closely together. I think working with our international partners, so one of the things we do, this is a global industry. So actually when I was in the US and when we get visitors coming here, whether they're airlines, aerospace, other politicians talking about how we regulate this industry, it's going to be an industry that's always regulated because of the necessary safety reasons, making sure that we try and facilitate flying and work with our global partners to make that easier. Quite often in our trade discussions we talk about air services agreements, about making it easier for us to travel. So I think there's a responsibility to do all of those things. On your humorously put but serious point about Wales, look, I think that rather illustrates the point. I was very clear yesterday. I think 20 mile an hour zones for vehicles on the ground, totally sensible for near schools, in areas where there are accident black spots, or stopping rat running. Totally sensible. What's not sensible is having a blanket policy across the whole of Wales, changing every 30 mile an hour speed limit to 20, regardless of circumstances. Because apart from anything else, the evidence that we did in a study that took place, I think, in 2018, was that it doesn't drop the average speed very much. It actually increases pollution in some cases, but also people don't follow rules that they don't think are sensible. And actually the danger is that then in the areas where you should be having a lower speed limit, actually people don't take any notice of it. And I just don't think it's a very sensible way to go about things. I think giving local authorities the power to do sensible things for sensible circumstances, for local conditions, is the right way, not having a blanket policy across a whole area. So that's why we made it clear we're not going to be doing that in England, and the Welsh Labour government will have to account for itself with its voters. It's worth remembering, of course, Keir Starmer tells us that the Welsh Labour government is the blueprint for a Labour government across the rest of the country, so you have been warned.
Yep.
Thank you. Councillor Hannah Gray, also from Bromley, and also working with Biggin Hill Airport. But on a different level altogether, I'm the STEM ambassador and the community manager there. One of my tasks is to encourage young people to want to be involved in the aerospace world. I have run a project called Unite to Inspire, wanting to unite the aerospace world. Getting to the question. We want to encourage more women and girls to be involved in the aerospace world through a talent pipeline, not tokenism. So do you have a view on how we can encourage more women and young people, but more women, to be involved in the aerospace world? Do you think a cross-party think tank or initiative would be a good idea?
Look, on your general point, thank you for what you're doing to try and get the workforce to be more diverse. One of the things I'm afraid, Paul, I have discovered in this job is the transport sector generally isn't the most diverse in the world. And although I don't tend to help, when I go to meetings, often my department is the bit that brings the diversity. So the aviation minister is a woman, my two permanent secretaries are both women. My department is actually pretty good, actually. But sometimes I go to meetings and literally we are the only women in the room. So there's a job of work to do. The good thing is I referred in the answer earlier to Carl's question about some of the work that some of the airlines are doing with their apprenticeship schemes. They do look much more diverse. So I think in my experience, this is about making people think that these industries are for them, which means in all of the organisations, you want those in the organisation that come from diverse backgrounds, you need them to go out and show people that this is an industry that women can succeed in, that people from minority backgrounds can succeed in, so that people look at it and go, there are people like me who work in this industry, it is an industry for me. We need more girls, we're doing a lot to encourage more girls to do STEM subjects in schools, so that they can do those scientific jobs. And it's a piece of work I suspect that it will be not ever finished, but it's one that's really important. And the obvious lesson for businesses, every business I visit, whether it's in my constituency or doing this job, all say they struggle to hire people and find people with the skills. And my retort is always, well, if you rule out half the country, you're going to struggle to hire people. So if you want to get the most talented people, you've got to actually reach out across and get younger people, you've got to get people from both genders and from all backgrounds. So I think companies that are doing that, if there are things that companies want to do and they want the government support, then they should just ask and they will have it. So we'd be very happy to, if you're not already, it'd be very good to talk to you, have you talk to my officials and see if we can help. But thank you.
Anyone else? Yes? No? There's one more there. Yep. One more there. That may be the last. We'll see.
Hi, I'm Richard from Heathrow Airport. What more do you think can be done to increase the pace of airspace modernisation in the UK?
Okay, so for those that don't know, airspace modernisation is both a high up thing and a low down thing. So top level, what we're trying to do is modernise how airspace works when planes are flying at very high levels, which is to try and allow airlines to have more control over how they do that, which is good for carbon, but it's also good for optimising routes, and that work is underway at pace. It does come back a bit, Paul, to what you said, particularly with airspace modernisation lower down, is that does then impact on communities. And what tends to happen, like many things, is people who benefit from routes that mean they have less noise never say thank you. And the people that are impacted negatively speak up more loudly. So it is difficult to do, and I've been very clear with NATS and with the CAA that we want to try and move this along as fast as we can, because there are some really big benefits. You can actually drive some quite significant carbon savings by structuring airspace differently and enabling airlines to optimise how they fly, and there are some really sensible things you can do lower down. But again, you are balancing interests. The aerospace sector is doing a great job in producing aircraft that are quieter, which helps, but it's about balancing things. I suspect we'll never go as fast as airlines and airports will like us to, because we have to be mindful of public opinion, but we are very conscious that there's a really big win here. So all of the people involved in it have got a very clear steer from me that we want to go as fast as we can sensibly do.
And yeah.
Hi, Rebecca Ross from Johnson Matthey. So it's great that you're so supportive of sustainable aviation fuel, and also the government is supporting a number of projects to make sustainable aviation fuel in the UK. However, those projects they won't cover the UK government's target for sustainable aviation fuel use in 2030. In fact, they'll only cover about half of the demand. So how are you thinking about that, and particularly about the risk that will come to 2030? We won't have enough fuel domestically to meet that target. We'll be relying on imports from elsewhere, where there may also be a shortfall internationally. How are you thinking about ensuring that we can meet that commitment using domestically produced fuel?
So a couple of things. First of all, some people don't mind whether we make it domestically or import it. I think that does matter, because actually one of the things, again, we learned during the pandemic, whatever your contractual arrangements, if you have a crisis, in the end, states dial back to looking after, perfectly understandably, their own people first. So we don't want to be in a position where we switch dependence on fossil fuel and being dependent on dictators to being dependent on something else, and then finding when push comes to shove, we can't deal with that. So I think the first point is we want to set up a system where we can actually increase demand sufficiently rapidly. So there are obviously new businesses that have won some of our competitive processes that we hope to get into the industry. But clearly, one of the areas that I think will be essential for scale is to get some of the existing oil and gas companies to switch production into sustainable aviation fuel in order to scale it up at pace. And that's a conversation we're having. It's also a conversation when I was in the US. I know that the US government are having with their oil and gas producers as well about what their plans are. And that's clearly a conversation we need to have globally. There will clearly be imports and exports, and that's fine, but we want to make sure we get the balance right about how dependent or otherwise we are. So I think we're very alive to that, and as we develop whatever the sustainability, whatever the price stability mechanism is, we want to make sure it'll work to grow that supply to meet up where demand will be set because of the mandate.
Okay, look, I've got three lots of people to thank really at the end. The first, of course, Mark, being you. Thank you for dealing so very deftly and patiently with all the questions, bar, of course, those relating to HS2.
I did deal with them.
You did deal with them. You did.
Perhaps
deal
not satisfactory to the people that asked them.
You closed them down, whereas with other questions you delightfully open them up. And actually, I'm particularly grateful to you for explaining some of the questions to the audience who might not have followed the specialist arguments at stake. So thank you very much. Then, of course, naturally, I want to thank Airlines UK, Airbus, Heathrow, Manchester Airports Group for co-sponsoring this event. Actually, finally, just a personal note, it was really pleasant, and I mean this with no offence to anyone else, to have so many questions this afternoon from party members here. We've had 3 or 4. That's really great. Hasn't always been the case at all the meetings, as after all, this is a Conservative Party conference. So thank you all very much. Thank you.
That was good.